In the high-pressure world of celebrity interviews, respect is a currency often in short supply. But when an arrogant journalist decided to corner Gene Hackman's daughter with condescending questions about her famous father, he had no idea he was walking into a lesson in dignity that would leave an entire studio audience speechless. Drop a comment where you're watching from today as we dive into this remarkable encounter that proves the apple doesn't fall far from the tree when it comes to commanding respect. The confrontation took place on the glossy set of Celebrity Spotlight, one of those mid-morning talk shows where the lighting is always too bright and the questions often too personal. It was supposed to be a routine interview promoting Elizabeth Hackman's new documentary film, a project she had poured 3 years of her life into without once leveraging her father's legendary name. The acclaimed actor's daughter had deliberately carved her own path in the industry, working her way up from production assistant to director through merit alone, a fact that seemed to perplex many in Hollywood who expected nepotism to be her ladder to success. The studio that morning buzzed with the usual pre-show energy, makeup artists making final touches, producers speaking urgently into headsets, the audience settling into their seats with anticipation. Elizabeth sat in the green room, reviewing her notes one last time. At 43, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her worth didn't depend on external validation. Her film had already received critical acclaim at several independent festivals, focusing on environmental activists working in remote regions of South America, a far cry from the glittering Hollywood world her father had inhabited. When the show's host, Malcolm Reed, strutted into the green room to introduce himself before the segment, there was something immediately disconcerting about his demeanor. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and his handshake felt like a performance rather than a greeting. "Looking forward to our chat," he said, already turning away before Elizabeth could respond. A producer whispered something in his ear, and Malcolm nodded with a smirk that suggested the interview might not follow the agreed-upon talking points. The red light on the camera blinked to life as Elizabeth took her seat across from Malcolm on the main stage. The audience applauded politely, many likely wondering who she was, despite the introduction, highlighting her documentary's achievements. Malcolm leaned forward with practiced intensity, his expression a mask of journalistic interest that barely concealed something more predatory. "So, Elizabeth Hackman," he began, emphasizing her surname in a way that immediately framed her identity through her father's legacy. "You've directed this documentary about environmental activism in South America, quite a departure from the Hollywood blockbusters your father is known for." Elizabeth nodded politely. "Yes, documentary filmmaking has always been my passion. The storytelling is more direct." "Was that a conscious rebellion?" Malcolm interrupted, his tone suggesting he'd struck upon some psychological insight. "Going as far away from your father's world as possible?" The audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing the aggressive turn in questioning. Elizabeth, however, maintained her composure, hands resting calmly in her lap. "I wouldn't characterize following my own interests as rebellion, Malcolm. Different generations often have different artistic expressions." Malcolm seemed disappointed by her measured response. He leaned back slightly, recalibrating. "Your father, Gene Hackman, one of the greatest actors of his generation, 2 Academy Awards, countless iconic roles. That must cast quite a shadow to live under." It wasn't phrased as a question, but the implication was clear. Elizabeth's smile remained steady, though something flashed briefly in her eyes, not anger, but recognition of the tired pattern this interview was following. She'd been fielding variations of these questions since film school. "My father's accomplishments are extraordinary," she acknowledged, "and I'm tremendously proud of his work." "But surely," Malcolm pressed, his voice taking on an almost sympathetic tone that fooled no one, "it must be difficult knowing that whatever you achieve will always be compared to his legacy. Do you think you'll ever reach that level of recognition?" A subtle murmur rippled through the audience. The question crossed a line from probing to openly disrespectful. The camera caught a producer wincing off stage, but Malcolm seemed oblivious to the growing discomfort in the room, fixated on extracting an emotional reaction. Elizabeth took a moment before responding, her deliberate pause drawing attention to the inappropriate nature of the question. When she spoke, her voice remained level, but carried a quiet authority that commanded attention. "Malcolm, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding here about how creative people measure success." The journalist shifted in his seat, unprepared for the calm redirection. He'd expected either defensiveness or celebrity child entitlement. Elizabeth continued, "My father built an extraordinary career through dedication to his craft and the courage to take on challenging roles that weren't always commercially safe choices. The lesson I took from watching him wasn't about fame or awards, but about artistic integrity." Malcolm attempted to regain control of the narrative, but certainly having the Hackman name opened doors that... "Actually," Elizabeth interjected with gentle firmness, "I worked under my mother's maiden name for the first decade of my career. Most of my early colleagues had no idea about my family background. It was important to me to know that opportunities came based on my work, not assumptions." This revelation visibly startled Malcolm, who glanced down at his notes as if searching for this information. The audience, meanwhile, leaned forward collectively, their interest genuinely piqued by this glimpse into Elizabeth's professional journey. Malcolm recovered quickly, doubling down on his original angle. "That's admirable, but let's be honest. Your current project has received attention partly because of who your father is. Don't you think it's somewhat disingenuous to pretend otherwise?" There it was, the accusation barely veiled as a question, the assumption that her success couldn't possibly be earned. The camera caught several audience members exchanging uncomfortable glances. Elizabeth straightened almost imperceptibly in her chair, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "You know, it's interesting you should frame it that way," she began, her tone conversational, but with an underlying strength that seemed to fill the studio. "I've found that people who are secure in their own accomplishments rarely feel the need to diminish others' work or attribute their success to external factors." The subtle shift in power was palpable. Malcolm's expression flickered between surprise and the beginning of comprehension that he might have miscalculated, but Elizabeth wasn't finished. Her response was just beginning to unfold, measured and articulate, building toward a moment that would leave the studio utterly silent. The weight of Elizabeth's words hung in the air as the studio lights seemed to intensify, casting Malcolm's increasingly uncomfortable expression in sharp relief. The audience had fallen completely silent, the usual restless shifting and whispered comments replaced by rapt attention. Even the cameramen, usually stoic professionals, focused solely on their equipment, were watching the exchange with undisguised interest. My documentary follows environmental activists who risk their lives daily in regions where corporate interests have essentially replaced governmental authority, Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining quiet momentum. These are people who have watched their communities suffer from contaminated water sources and devastating deforestation. They've faced death threats, lost friends to suspicious accidents, yet continue their work because they believe in something larger than themselves. She leaned forward slightly, not in aggression, but in genuine engagement. When I spent those 3 years documenting their stories, not once did any of them ask about my family or background. They cared only about whether I would tell their truth, honestly, and with respect for their agency. So, when you suggest my work receives attention primarily because of my father's name, you're not only dismissing my 20 years in this industry, but also diminishing the profound importance of these activists' stories. Malcolm's expression shifted between defensive and calculating. He hadn't expected this level of composed pushback. The segment was veering far from his planned narrative of extracting either tearful confessions about living in a legend's shadow or entitled outbursts he could later characterize as Hollywood royalty tantrums. "I'm simply acknowledging the reality of industry connections," he attempted, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished. "Surely you can admit that..." "Let's talk about industry connections," Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully, interrupting him with such natural authority that he fell silent immediately. "When I worked as a production assistant on my first documentary about homeless veterans, I slept in my car for 3 months because the project had run out of funding. I didn't call my father. When our equipment was stolen during my second film in Detroit, I took out a personal loan rather than asking for family help." She paused, allowing these details to sink in. The audience was completely still now, collectively holding their breath. Those weren't choices made from pride or rebellion, Malcolm. They were decisions about the kind of filmmaker, the kind of person I wanted to be, someone who builds something authentic through their own efforts and failures. Malcolm's producer was making frantic gestures from beside the main camera, likely indicating they should move to a commercial break, but the journalist seemed transfixed, unable to wrest control of the conversation back from Elizabeth's measured responses. "What's interesting to me," Elizabeth continued, her tone genuinely contemplative rather than confrontational, "is why certain narratives seem so appealing to the media. The idea that someone must either be crushed by a successful parent's shadow or riding on their coattails. The possibility that different generations of a family might simply respect each other's different paths seems strangely difficult for some to accept." The audience began nodding in agreement, several people exchanging glances that suggested Elizabeth was articulating something many had felt but rarely heard expressed so eloquently. Malcolm glanced at them, suddenly aware that the room's sympathies had shifted decisively away from him. "I'm simply asking questions our viewers would want answered," he said, attempting to align himself with the audience rather than against them. "People are naturally curious about famous families." "Of course they are," Elizabeth agreed amiably. "And I understand that curiosity, but there's a difference between genuine interest and creating narratives that don't exist. My relationship with my father has always been one of mutual respect. He taught me that real accomplishment comes from the quality of your work, not the attention it receives." She smiled slightly, a genuine warmth reaching her eyes. "One of the most valuable things he gave me wasn't his name or connections, but the example of how he treated people on set, from leading actors to catering staff with equal respect. That influenced me far more than any advice about the industry." Malcolm, sensing he needed to regain some control of the segment, shuffled his note cards and forced a smile. "Well, speaking of your father's career, many people wonder if he might come out of retirement for one final role. Do you think—" "My father made a clear decision to retire in 2004, after nearly 50 years in the industry," Elizabeth stated firmly. "He's earned his privacy and the right to define the conclusion of his own career. I'm here to discuss my documentary, which follows the stories of indigenous environmental activists facing corporate exploitation. Their courage in standing up to powerful interests with few resources deserves far more attention than speculation about a well-documented retirement." The redirection was so smooth yet decisive that Malcolm found himself momentarily speechless. In the control room, producers were frantically signaling to cut to commercial, sensing the interview had veered irretrievably from their planned course. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. When she spoke again, her voice carried a philosophical quality that seemed to expand beyond the immediate tension of the interview. "You know, Malcolm, one thing I've observed repeatedly while making documentaries is how quickly people project their own insecurities onto others. When I interviewed corporate executives who dismissed environmental activists as publicity seekers, I often found they were actually describing their own motivations." The parallel to Malcolm's questioning hung in the air, unmistakable yet unstated. Several audience members exchanged knowing glances, and someone in the back row actually snickered. "I've always found that the most interesting stories come from asking people about their own journeys rather than imposing narratives on them," Elizabeth continued. "When we genuinely listen, rather than waiting for moments that confirm our preconceptions, we discover so much more complexity and truth." The camera caught Malcolm's expression as it shifted from professional detachment to something approaching genuine reflection. Perhaps for the first time in the interview, he seemed to be truly hearing her words, rather than planning his next angle of attack. "So, if you're interested in who I am beyond being Gene Hackman's daughter," Elizabeth offered with gentle but unmistakable firmness, "I'd be happy to discuss the 3 years I spent documenting environmental activism in regions most film crews won't enter, or how these communities are developing innovative protection strategies without governmental support." The poised challenge in her invitation was clear. She was offering Malcolm a chance to salvage the interview by engaging with her actual work rather than continuing down the path of tired family narratives. The studio remained utterly silent, all eyes moving between Elizabeth's composed expression and Malcolm's increasingly flustered demeanor as he felt the careful framework of his planned ambush crumbling around him. In that suspended moment, the entire studio seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if Malcolm would rise to Elizabeth's challenge or retreat to his prepared script. The tension wasn't from hostility, but from the quiet power shift that had occurred, a rebalancing that everyone present could feel. Even the stage lights seemed to recognize the significance, casting Elizabeth in a gentle glow, while Malcolm sat partially shadowed, his famous confidence visibly wavering. "Let's talk about your documentary, then," Malcolm finally said, adopting a tone of professional interest that sounded forced, even to his own ears. "What drew you to focus on environmental activism specifically?" Elizabeth accepted this pivot with gracious professionalism, though everyone present understood it wasn't genuine curiosity, but strategic retreat. "The intersection of environmental justice and human rights has always fascinated me," she began, her passion for the subject immediately evident. "These communities aren't fighting abstract battles about conservation. They're fighting for their immediate survival, for clean water, for land that sustains rather than poisons them." As she spoke about her documentary subjects with genuine reverence and detailed knowledge, Malcolm's expression gradually shifted from defensive formality to reluctant engagement. The stories Elizabeth shared, of a grandmother who stood against bulldozers destroying her ancestral forest, of young activists using drone technology to document illegal mining operations, carried an authenticity that demanded attention. One of the women I followed, Maria Constanza, had received 3 death threats the week before we began filming. Elizabeth explained, her voice steady but tinged with appropriate gravity. When I asked if she wanted to postpone, she told me that visibility was her only protection, that if her story reached beyond her remote village, those threatening her might hesitate to make her a martyr. The audience, initially drawn in by the promised spectacle of celebrity confrontation, now leaned forward for entirely different reasons. Elizabeth had transformed the atmosphere from tabloid tension to meaningful discourse through nothing but the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she stood for. "And did that visibility help protect her?" Malcolm asked, a flicker of genuine journalistic curiosity breaking through his practiced persona. "It did," Elizabeth nodded, though not in ways we anticipated. After our initial footage was shared at a film festival, environmental organizations established a permanent observation post in her region. The corporations didn't leave, but the most blatant violations decreased substantially. Maria told me later that the simple act of being witnessed, of having her truth acknowledged, was itself a form of justice she hadn't expected. Malcolm seemed momentarily at a loss, the easy cynicism that usually fueled his interview style faltering against Elizabeth's earnest dedication. He glanced down at his notes, likely searching for a way to steer the conversation back to more sensationalist territory. "Your father played several characters who stood up against corrupt systems," he attempted, in films like The Conversation and Mississippi Burning. "Did those roles influence your interest in stories about people challenging powerful interests?" It was a transparent attempt to circle back to the famous father angle, but Elizabeth accepted the question without visible irritation. "Films can certainly shape our understanding of justice," she acknowledged thoughtfully. "I grew up watching stories about moral courage from many filmmakers, not just my father's work. But the most profound influence on my perspective was probably my mother, who worked as a human rights attorney long before it was fashionable to do so." This mention of her less famous parent, deliberately excluded from Malcolm's framing of her identity, served as another subtle correction to his narrative without directly challenging him. Several audience members nodded appreciatively at this deft redirection. "She taught me that real heroism rarely looks like the dramatic moments we see in movies," Elizabeth continued. "It's usually found in the persistence of ordinary people who keep showing up day after day, even when cameras aren't rolling and no one is applauding. That's the kind of courage my documentary tries to capture." Malcolm shifted strategies again, adopting an expression of exaggerated skepticism. "Critics might suggest that a filmmaker with your, let's say, privileged background might be engaging in a form of poverty tourism by documenting struggles so far removed from your own experience. How would you respond to that?" The question was designed to provoke defensiveness, but Elizabeth received it with the same thoughtful consideration she'd shown throughout. "That's actually an important ethical concern for any documentarian," she agreed, surprising Malcolm with her willingness to engage with the criticism. "The power dynamic between filmmaker and subject requires constant examination. That's why I spent 6 months living in the community before we began filming, learning the language, building relationships based on trust rather than extraction. She leaned forward slightly, her passion evident. And I established a profit-sharing model where 30% of the film's proceeds go directly back to the communities featured, with their representatives having decision-making power about how those funds are used. Ethical filmmaking isn't about pretending privileges don't exist. It's about consciously restructuring the typical power dynamics of who benefits from these stories being told. Malcolm blinked, clearly unprepared for such a comprehensive response to what he'd intended as a gotcha question. The audience's reaction was equally telling, several people nodding with approval, others looking genuinely impressed. The producer was making frantic signals again, likely indicating they needed to wrap up the segment that had veered so far from its planned sensationalism. "We're almost out of time," Malcolm said, glancing at the studio clock with poorly concealed relief. "Is there anything you'd like to share about future projects?" It was a standard closing question, designed to be innocuous. But Elizabeth took this final opportunity to elegantly reinforce the lesson she'd been delivering throughout the entire exchange. "I'm currently developing a series about different models of community resilience, examining how people adapt to challenges from climate change to economic displacement without waiting for institutional support," she explained. "What fascinates me is how often the most innovative solutions come from those with the fewest resources, but the strongest connections to each other." She smiled warmly, her gaze encompassing both Malcolm and the audience. "I think we often look for heroism in the wrong places, expecting it from celebrities or authority figures when it's actually flourishing in ordinary people who simply refuse to accept injustice as inevitable." The subtle parallel to her own refusal to accept Malcolm's reductive framing wasn't lost on anyone present. As the director signaled 1 minute remaining, Malcolm attempted to reassert some control over the closing moments. "And finally, what advice would you give to young filmmakers trying to establish themselves in the industry today?" he asked, visibly eager to conclude the interview that had so thoroughly escaped his manipulation. Elizabeth considered the question with genuine thoughtfulness, her response directed not at Malcolm, but at the audience members who might truly benefit from her perspective. "Focus on the stories that keep you awake at night, not the ones you think will advance your career. Develop your own measure of success, rather than chasing external validation. And remember that the most powerful thing you can offer subjects is not exposure, but respect for their dignity and agency in how their stories are told." As the segment's closing music began to play softly in the background, Elizabeth added with quiet sincerity, "In my experience, authentic work eventually finds its audience. The path might be longer and less glamorous than you imagined, but it leads to a career you can be genuinely proud of, regardless of whose name you carry." The camera lingered on her composed expression as Malcolm hurriedly wrapped up the segment, the studio audience erupting into applause that carried an unmistakable note of appreciation for the masterclass in dignity they had just witnessed. Elizabeth had come to discuss her documentary, but had delivered something far more valuable, a demonstration of how grace under pressure reveals true character, and how genuine authority needs no famous name to command respect. The applause continued long after the on-air lights dimmed, something almost unheard of for mid-morning talk show segments. Elizabeth acknowledged the audience's response with a modest nod before removing her microphone pack, her movements unhurried and deliberate. Malcolm, meanwhile, hurriedly removed his own microphone and exited the stage without the customary post-segment pleasantries, his producer rushing after him with a concerned expression. Backstage, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. Staff members who had barely glanced at Elizabeth during pre-show preparations now watched her with undisguised admiration. A young production assistant approached hesitantly, clutching a worn notebook. "Ms. Hackman," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say, that was incredible. I've been working here for 8 months, and I've never seen anyone handle Malcolm like that. Usually people either get angry or totally shut down." Elizabeth smiled warmly at the young woman. "What's your name?" "Alicia. I'm just an assistant, but I'm hoping to direct documentaries someday." "Well, Alicia, there's no just about being an assistant. That's where most of us start," Elizabeth responded. "And thank you for your kind words, though I wasn't trying to handle anyone. Sometimes conversations just need gentle redirection towards substance." In the control room, the show's executive producer was reviewing the segment footage with an expression that shifted between concern and calculating interest. "We're going to need to edit this carefully before the West Coast broadcast," he muttered to his team. "But this might actually play better than the ambush we planned. The social media team says mentions of the show are spiking already." Indeed, across various platforms, clips from the interview were already circulating widely. Gene Hackman's daughter, school's arrogant journalist, became the leading trending topic within an hour, though most commenters focused not on her famous parentage, but on the substance of her responses and the dignity with which she'd redirected the conversation. Media outlets that typically trafficked in celebrity gossip found themselves in the unusual position of discussing journalistic ethics and documentary filmmaking methodology. Several prominent entertainment journalists posted lengthy threads analyzing their own industry's tendency toward reductive narratives about celebrity children versus allowing accomplished individuals to exist on their own terms. Back in her hotel room that evening, Elizabeth fielded a call from her publicist, who was breathlessly recounting the explosion of interest in both her and her documentary. "We've received interview requests from every major outlet," the publicist explained excitedly. "They all want to talk about your film now. The streaming service is reporting a 600% increase in viewers since this morning. This is the kind of publicity we couldn't buy." Elizabeth listened patiently before responding. "That's gratifying to hear, particularly for the activists whose stories deserve this attention, but I hope we can be selective about which interview requests we accept. I'd prefer to focus on outlets that have shown interest in environmental and indigenous issues previously, not just those looking to extend today's viral moment." Her measured response was characteristic of the approach that had made her interview with Malcolm so compelling. A refusal to be swept up in superficial metrics of success or to compromise her principles, even when presented with opportunities most filmmakers would eagerly embrace. Meanwhile, in his office, Malcolm was facing uncomfortable questions from network executives about his handling of the interview. "You were supposed to get compelling television, not make yourself look like a dismissive hack," one executive scolded. "Do you have any idea how many complaints we've received? This isn't the early 2000s anymore. Audiences don't want to see women with actual accomplishments reduced to who their father is." Malcolm's defense that he was simply asking tough questions fell flat against the evidence of the footage itself. "She wasn't upset by tough questions about her work," another executive pointed out. "You never actually asked any. You were fishing for family drama that wasn't there, and she called you on it with more class than you deserved." The fallout continued into the following days, with media analysts dissecting the exchange as a textbook example of journalistic failure meeting poised authenticity. Several industry veterans pointed out that Malcolm's approach represented an outdated model of celebrity journalism that relied on manufacturing conflict rather than engaging with substance. What made this exchange so powerful wasn't just Elizabeth Hackman's composure, noted one respected media critic. It was her refusal to accept the fundamental premise of Malcolm's questioning, that her identity and work could only be understood through the lens of her famous parent. By consistently redirecting to her actual accomplishments and the important stories her documentary tells, she exposed the intellectual laziness underlying so much of celebrity coverage. Perhaps most significantly, the viral nature of the interview led to substantial attention for the environmental activists featured in Elizabeth's documentary. Organizations working in the regions she had documented reported major increases in donations and volunteer applications. Several lawmakers even cited statistics from the film when questioning corporate representatives about their environmental practices abroad. 3 weeks after the interview, Elizabeth received a handwritten letter that had been forwarded through her production company. The return address indicated it was from Malcolm Reed. She opened it with mild curiosity, expecting perhaps a publicist-crafted non-apology designed to rehabilitate his image. Instead, she found a surprisingly personal note. "I've spent 20 years building a career on extracting emotional reactions from people, measuring my success by ratings and viral moments," he had written. "Your refusal to engage on those terms forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my approach to journalism. While I'm not sure I can entirely reinvent myself at this stage, I wanted you to know that our exchange has prompted genuine reflection." Elizabeth appreciated the honesty of the note, recognizing that meaningful change rarely happens through public shaming, but through private reckonings. She responded with a brief but gracious message, acknowledging his reflection and suggesting several resources on ethical approaches to documentary subjects that had shaped her own evolution as a filmmaker. 6 months later, when her new documentary series premiered at a major festival, Elizabeth was surprised to spot Malcolm among the attendees. He approached her at the post-screening reception, visibly more subdued than his on-screen persona. "That was remarkable work," he said simply. "I'm particularly impressed by how you let communities tell their own stories, rather than imposing a narrative framework on them." "Thank you, Malcolm," she replied with genuine appreciation. "That approach takes more time, but yields something far more authentic." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'm learning that the hard way. I've started a podcast focusing on long-form conversations rather than gotcha moments. The audience is smaller, but the conversations feel more meaningful." Their brief exchange represented something rarely seen in the typically ego-driven entertainment industry: the possibility that confrontation could lead not to entrenched positions, but to growth on both sides. Elizabeth had stood her ground with unwavering dignity, offering not just resistance to reductive framing, but a path toward more substantive engagement. The legacy of their viral moment extended far beyond temporary fame or career advancement. For many young journalists, it became a case study in the difference between challenging questions and manufactured conflict. For aspiring filmmakers, particularly those from famous families, it offered a template for establishing independent identity without rejecting or overemphasizing one's origins. But perhaps most importantly, for the millions who watched the exchange online, it provided a masterclass in responding to disrespect with composed dignity, in refusing to engage on terms designed to diminish rather than illuminate. In a media landscape often dominated by reactive outrage and defensive posturing, Elizabeth Hackman had demonstrated the quiet power of knowing one's own worth and standing firmly in that knowledge. As one commenter succinctly put it, "In trying to reduce her to Gene Hackman's daughter, he accidentally revealed she's entirely her father's equal in commanding respect and attention, not through famous roles or Hollywood legacy, but through something far more valuable: authentic integrity that no interview ambush could shake." The viral moment eventually faded, as all such moments do, but its impact remained in Malcolm's evolving approach to interviews, in the increased attention to the environmental causes Elizabeth's documentary highlighted, and in countless conversations about how we measure accomplishment beyond the shadows of famous names. Sometimes the most profound lessons come not from careful planning, but from unexpected moments when someone simply refuses to be anything less than their whole, authentic self.